Well, we can chat a little bit more about this now with Richard Tice, the co-chair of Leave Means Leave, which campaigns for a Brexit which will see Britain leave the single market. Lucy Thomas, who is the former Deputy Director of Britain Stronger in Europe, which campaigned for us to stay in the EU, and Henry Newman, who is the Director of Open Europe, a think tank which opposes the European Union, and he's also a former advisor to the Environment Secretary Michael Gove. Thank you all for coming in. Richard, first of all, what is it that you want to hear from the Prime Minister today in that speech in Florence?
Look, she's going to give some very warm words. I think it's really important that she reiterates that we are leaving the European Union, we're leaving the single market, we're leaving the customs union. Of course we're good friends and neighbours. Of course we'll settle our accounts that are legally due, and it may be that actually morally we pay a bit more. But the real key is that whatever she says, of course the European Union is going to say it's not enough. And what she needs to make very clear is that if they push it too far, then we will just walk away without a deal, because we all know in business, that's where I come from, no deal is always better than a bad deal.
I can see a shaking head straight away. Do come in.
I couldn't disagree more, actually. I think for most businesses, actually certainty is the real watchword. And so what they need to know is what happens on day one when we leave. So it's really welcome that there is going to be talk of a transition of 2 years, so businesses can plan, they can know what the terms are going to be. But the idea of walking away without a deal, I think actually what I'm hearing is that that is no longer part of the plan. She's not going to say no deal is better than a bad deal, precisely because it's so catastrophic for business.
Nonsense. That is a disastrous negotiating tactic. David Cameron saw that if you're not prepared to walk away, you end up with a bad deal. Businesses have already had 15 months. They've got another 18 months to plan. Most countries around the world operate under WTO rules. We can perfectly happily do the same as a base case.
Just to clarify for a moment, I just want to clarify. So you think this 2-year transitional period, which Theresa May is putting forward, where she actually wants to pay in but also be able to negotiate trade deals, is the right way for business to avoid that cliff edge people have been talking about?
Well, what's critical is that we can start negotiating trade deals, we can start deregulating, we can change our immigration rules. If nothing changes in that 2-year period, then actually all you're doing is extending the status quo. Okay, that makes no difference.
Come in,
but I was going to say, I think if we take a step back, this is the first major update we've had from the Prime Minister on the overall Brexit policy, really in 9 months since the Lancaster House speech. And I'm not too worried about a transition. I think we can argue over whether transition is necessary or not, but really what we should be concentrating on is what sort of future relationship do we want to have with the EU? And I think the Prime Minister is right to say that both sides here have a moral duty and a duty on their citizens and businesses to actually come to an agreement. The EU is also under a legal duty to negotiate and conclude an agreement with the UK. And I think they're in danger by stalling the talks, by refusing to switch to parallel discussions on trade and the future state, of making that impossible.
Isn't the problem here that actually Theresa May is in an incredibly weak position, and she called the general election, she wanted to go to Brussels being strong and saying, this is what we're doing. And that's not the reality at all.
Well, the reality is she's still the Prime Minister, she still commands the Commons, and under our Constitution, she's in charge. She's the one who's determining the policy. And what we saw was a Cabinet discussion on the future direction of Brexit. The Cabinet agreed. And we'll see a bit more of the detail later today. But
well,
I think
the Cabinet agreed, except the Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson decided to write in the Telegraph, basically outlining his own personal vision, which appeared to be completely different from the rest of the
What the
Cabinet.
Foreign Secretary did was exactly what a Foreign Secretary should do, which is promote the interests of the UK optimistically to the rest of the world. It was a fantastic article.
Without telling the Prime Minister his boss.
It's completely in line with the Lancaster House speech, so there's no difference between them. You know, the only real difference is the detail of the transitional agreement. We must be free to start changing things. If we're not, there's no change.
Inevitably, there's some discussions inside Cabinet about the future, because this is one of the most important issues that the country has ever faced. It's the most fundamental constitutional question of all. So, yes, there's divergence around the Cabinet table. Different ministers took different positions, but actually, the Prime Minister's managed to chart a way through to find agreement, and we'll see more about that later today. But I think what we should really be asking is, what sort of relationship do we want to be having in the long term with Europe? We need to be further enough away from the single market and the European institutions that we can determine our own future. Yep. There'll be some areas where we want to remain very, very close to Europe on defence and security cooperation, on some regulations, but other areas where we want to move further away. So there will be costs of leaving Europe, and we discussed all those extensively during the referendum, but there will also be benefits. And if we stay too close, we can't get any of the benefits.
Well, I think actually, taking a step back, I really don't envy Theresa May. I think she's got a really difficult job on her hands. I disagree with you both about Boris Johnson, I'm afraid. I think this was absolutely him getting his vision out there before Theresa May, so he could say, look, I've had a go. I said it should be optimistic, and oh, look, it's going to be optimistic. But I think, so she has her Cabinet audience here to try and keep everybody on side. She's so far got them to agree to the transition terms, but actually, as Henry says, what about going further forward, what are the future trade terms? She can't get her cabinet to agree on that. And then you have the EU side, who she absolutely has to try and unlock this deadlock with them. She'll talk about the bill, which will hopefully make some progress towards that. She'll talk about citizens' rights. But actually, I think, having sort of listened to what Michel Barnier said yesterday, it's perfectly possible the EU will come back and say, I'm sorry, guys, this isn't enough.
Of course they will. Of course they will. The EU will always say, no, redo your homework. This isn't enough. We need more clarity. But they're good at the theatre of negotiations. We shouldn't take everything that Brussels says at face value. They're going to come back and say, insufficient progress, strive harder, do more. And I think we should be a little bit sceptical about that. We've gone in good faith.
Who holds the cards, though? Who holds the cards? It's 27 other countries.
They export
the money,
70 billion more
well.
to us than we do to them. We hold the cards. This issue of paying for access is a nonsense. If anybody's going to pay, the EU should pay us in the future because they export so much more to us.
You say that we hold the cards, but the reality is the business community will say that if there's a cliff...
No, that's complete... I'm sorry,
For a moment,
Chloe,
just let me finish. If there's a cliff edge, which, you know...
There is no cliff edge.
But there could be if the EU turns around and says...
There's no cliff, let alone an edge.
But that's your personal opinion, Richard, and other people watching this programme would say, who work in business, will say the fear is there's a cliff edge. We heard from MPs earlier on today, an hour ago on this programme, saying the real concern is people's jobs and people's businesses, and they will worry that if there is a cliff edge, that is going to affect their business. So that's your opinion, but it's not what everybody watching this programme will feel.
Sure, no, that's not what everybody... But the reality is, let's remember, over 90% of businesses don't export to the European Union, so they're not affected by it. You know, I mean, that's the clear point.
Well, they're absolutely affected by the pound plummeting, inflation rising, people having less money in their pocket. That's happening now.
Well, that's already happened, and it's interesting, isn't it?
Yes, and businesses are suffering.
Well, they're not suffering. Businesses are employing more people, 400,000 more people than a year ago. Unemployment's a record low. The economy is doing really well. What's really exciting is that already supermarkets are looking to source more products in the UK. House builders, car manufacturers are already sourcing more products in the UK. There are so many exciting opportunities, and yet there is so much sort of negativity in Westminster about, you know, the downsides, when actually the upsides, which Boris referred to, are so much more exciting.
You say the economy is doing well. It's worth pointing out at this point that the pound has plummeted, and we've had Mark Carney, the head of the Bank of England, saying that he's potentially going to have to raise interest rates, and we have to worry. So there's different views.
I think the economy is in a mixed position. Clearly, unemployment is down, record low. Employment is at record high. Tax take and personal self-employed tax take, again, record high. So I don't think anybody's got that clear a picture about what's happening to the economy overall. Lucy's right to say there's been a correction in the pound. Inflation is up in the UK. Inflation is also up in the Eurozone. German inflation jumped up about 1% since last year. So a complicated picture. Certainly not the sort of level of economic impact that we were told to expect after the referendum by
because there was a whole load of QE and there were emergency measures put in place to deal with the problems.
Whether we have any of the cards in this negotiation. I think Norman Smith's package earlier was exactly on the money. This is a question of cash. The EU wants our cash, and Theresa May has said quite clearly that we'll settle our debts, we'll settle our obligations, and the transition is a way of actually paying to play. So I think it'll go some way towards giving the EU some of the money that they need, and the money overall is one of the cards where the UK is strongest. Lucy's right, the EU has other cards in this negotiation, but I think it's also important to go back to what the Prime Minister said, and this is in today's newspapers and breaking the news today. There's a moral duty on both sides to come to an agreement. Businesses want that, citizens want that. This is a divorce, and we can do so amicably. It doesn't need to kind of reach this stage of acrimony so quickly.
How much of this is about divisions within the Conservative Party that's being played out in Brussels and potentially to the detriment of Britain?
Yeah, I think unfortunately we've seen the negotiations being done a little bit piecemeal. What should have ideally happened was that you get agreement within Cabinet, you get a clear position of this is what we're going to be asking for, and then we go for it, and then you trigger Article 50 once you know all of that. It's kind of been the other way around. We triggered Article 50, 6 months on, there's still all of this disagreement, different Cabinet ministers saying different things, and so it's really unfortunate in my mind that the talks are being dominated by all of those differences, and so the UK isn't united and the EU sees that.
But that's why it's important that the Prime Minister now sets out the government's policy today, and then I think everybody can point to that and say that is the policy. Part of the problem, I think, is over the last 9 months we haven't heard that much from the Prime Minister. We've had the Article 50 speech, we had a sort of flurry of important position papers over the summer, but on detailed technical questions. Once she's laid out the government's overall policy, then I think the whole Cabinet can point to that and say that is the policy. And actually, despite the changes of the general election back in June, the policy hasn't shifted since Lancaster House. We're still leaving the single market, we're still leaving the customs union. The transition will, in some senses, to use another Italian metaphor, mean that everything changes but nothing changes. And we'll be out of the single market, out of the customs union and out of the EU. at the end of the Article 50 process, but things will broadly stay the same. And that will give businesses the assurances that Lucy was saying they were requiring.
But, you know, the reality is many entrepreneurs up and down the country, from small businesses to big businesses, James Dyson, quite happy, as James Dyson said last week, to go to WTO. So it's
because
not all
where
businesses.
does he do his manufacturing? He does his manufacturing in the Far East, so he doesn't actually have people here. He doesn't export
But he exports,
from here.
he does export from here. He's quite relaxed because he's more worried about the regulatory impact. The key
But
thing
the
that Norman's...
tariffs,
No,
the
let's move
tariffs
back,
will
let's
make
move
the
back to
products
negotiations.
cost more money.
Let's
If
move
we
back
go
to
onto WTO rules, products will cost more. The cars you talked about exporting, 10% more expensive.
And that's why people are sourcing more from in the UK. It's a great opportunity for our manufacturing businesses. But let's just look at the negotiating process. We're only negotiating 1 week in 4 at the moment. If this was a business process, we'd be negotiating 24/7 every day of the week to get this done and done quickly. It's taking too long. I think probably there's one area where Lucy and I might agree, is that we need to accelerate this process. And that's absolutely critical.
I don't doubt
that's where the European Union are actually, you know, they've been very much at fault.
Thank you all so much. We could carry on talking about this for ages, and I suspect you will in the green room, but thank you so much for coming onto the programme.